Welcome to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Here to talk all things hockey are your hosts, Brad Crisco, Ryan Hanna, and Evan Lobsinger.
People are going to think we know something we didn't know for how well this was timed. Legitimately, the four of us were prepping for the show. We thought this was going to be a Berggren episode. This is our first ever Max Good in the Room episode, so that's why we're all remote for this one. Max Bultman officially joining as a contributor to the Winged Wheel Podcast. We thought this would be the Berggren show, and the Lucas Raymond signing drops moments before. And I will say, my baggage not being pulled off my plane onto the carousel and delaying me an hour saved us from a lot of hurt today. So, Max, this is a hell of a welcome for you as a contributor to the Winged Wheel Pod.
Always good to start things out with an adrenaline rush, and this is the adrenaline rush.
Folks, this is going to be a very interesting episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast. The topic of the day is Lucas Raymond signing. Another topic of the day is, obviously, Jonatan Berggren signed earlier in the day. And the third topic that we're all scared to say out loud is, when is the Moritz Seider deal going to be announced? Because we are still running the risk of that happening, soon after we record, but still, the show must go on. We're excited to bring you this episode. Again, a remote episode because this is the first of our monthly Max Bultman Good in the Room episode where Max joins us for the full show. Still, welcome to the Winged Wheel Podcast, here to talk to you about all things Detroit Red Wings hockey, the world of the NHL, Raymond, Berggren, and maybe Seider contracts, and lots more. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Hanna.
I'm Brad Crisco.
And I'm Evan.
How do we do this now with Max? Because
I'm going last.
I was just going to say.
You're going
I'm Max.
I'm playing the seniority card.
And we have Max Bultman with us. Max, I'm not going to say thank you for joining the show because you're just one of us now. You're thrown into the pit. All politeness is out the window. You've seen the mess that is our pre-show now.
I don't think even that's a mess. I think that's just the news game, baby, and we're in it.
Wait till you see overtime.
On this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast, we're going to start with Lucas Raymond's contract and then just go from there. It's going to be a very obvious progression. All of that's going to be pretty intuitive for the listener. So we're going to start with Lucas Raymond, analyzing the contract. We're going to see what that means for Moritz Seider, what might be next for him, how his might compare. We'll get into Berggren's contract. We'll get into some of the prospect, mini tournament, as we'll call it, as Max brings us his segment, Good in the Room, and then whatever else we have time for before we get into overtime. Before all that, I want to let you know that the Winged Wheel Podcast is primarily supported by our Patreon supporters, patreon.com/Winged Wheel Podcast. If you want to support the show, you get access to our bonus overtime episodes, which record right after these main ones. Max will be on for that. You get access to our bonus off-season episodes. We just actually posted one last week, which is a recording of our previous Winged Wheel Podcast night in Grand Rapids featuring head coach Dan Watson and former Griffin Matt Luff. You also get access to our Patreon exclusive Discord, and you're automatically entered into all of our giveaways. We give away 2 tickets to every Detroit Red Wings home game, the vast majority going directly to our Patreon supporters. So again, patreon.com/Winged Wheel Podcast. Max, you're the guest of honor today, although, again, have to stop calling you guest. We'll go to you first for initial reactions, thoughts, overall sentiment on Lucas Raymond signing a maximum 8-year, $8.075 million AAV contract announced just moments ago.
I think it's a really good deal for the Red Wings. I thought that Raymond, based on some of the comparables that are out there, could get higher than this number. Obviously, the Tim Stutzle number is kind of the gold standard that young forwards are looking to get, and you can debate that one. He had 58 points the season before he got an $8.35 million deal, obviously like a speculative contract by Ottawa that is paying off very well. And once Seth Jarvis signed the $7.9 million AAV deal earlier this summer, Raymond has a better resume than Jarvis, so he was going to get over that. But I think to keep him below 8.1 million is good with the comparables and could be great with what I think Lucas Raymond can do over the life of this 8-year contract. We know the cap is expected to go up over the course of this deal. I think this is a player who can score into the 80s points wise, threaten 90 points. If he had done a bridge deal, I think that this number would have come in way higher than this, could have done into the 10 millions 2 years from now if he had done a bridge deal and signed. That's not necessarily how you calculate surplus value because there's different factors that go into that. But I think it's very possible that the Red Wings are going to have a top 5 to 10 left wing in the NHL here on a really good $8 million contract for the vast majority of his prime. This deal takes him to when he's 30. I think it's a really good contract.
With the end of the season that Lucas Raymond had, and I actually want to point out that Max had his article ready to go and filed before we even hit record, so a monster as always. And Max, you talk about this a little bit too, and we've been chatting. Lucas Raymond's end to the season was phenomenal. You talk about what was the catalyst for pulling the Red Wings out of their funk and basically putting them in a situation where they were 1 point away from making the playoffs. He was that guy. The team was on his shoulders. The goalies were failing them before. Larkin being hurt let them down before. And Lucas Raymond was like the driving force for that. And so there was a time where we thought that number was going to be significantly higher than 8.1. And I know, things have cooled off a little bit. You go through the offseason and GMs are smart enough to not judge an 8-year contract based on, a 2-month span. But still, how much of a surprise would it be if you told yourself in April that Lucas Raymond was going to sign for this number?
Not like a total, oh my gosh, but like it's better than like what I thought it would have been at this. I mean, Evolving Hockey came out with their projections. I don't know what month those came out in. I think they're usually pretty early in the summer, but on an 8-year deal, and their projections are really good. I look at them very frequently. They had him at 8.86 on a 8-year deal. So to get basically an $800,000 discount off that. Now, I'm sure that is factoring like the Stutzle deal plus the percent of cap increase since then. And that's probably where that number comes from. But regardless, I think to get him, well below that and even below what Stutzle's number was, without the percent of cap adjustment, like that kind of speaks to the value the Red Wings got here. I do think the Jarvis deal kind of set that as the range because Jarvis also had a better resume than Stutzle at the time of that deal. And Jarvis took less than that. And so even though Raymond's resume is better than Jarvis's, he's going to slot, above Jarvis there, but it takes some of the teeth out of that. That's probably why, this is able to get done so comfortably, a comp like that. And all of a sudden you throw Cole Caulfield in there and there start to be more comps in the high 7s there. But to your point, like at the start of this, I think all of us on here would have said a really good deal for the Red Wings would have been $8.4 million, $8.5 million at the start of this offseason, well below that still.
Yeah, I think when you break down the contract, especially looking at the player Lucas Raymond is now, which is a 30-plus goal scorer, 70 to 75 point scorer, if that is what he is for the career, this is an acceptable contract. As Max already alluded to, the fact that there is still room for growth. He's only 22 years old. He's only going to get better. Hopefully the team around him is only going to get better. So 80, 90 points definitely isn't out of the range for Lucas Raymond, depending how much the salary cap can go up. Obviously, Lucas got his bag, but for the Red Wings specifically, this, in my mind, is a big, big win just because of the future value it can hold. We've spent this entire summer breaking down this contract, potential contract at the time, around what is the Red Wings contention window. We don't care about this year. I shouldn't say we don't care, but it's not that important. Get through this year, get through the next year, see what this core of Seider and Raymond and Larkin and some of the younger prospects are, and then build around that window. This contract takes it well into that window, and that's when this contract is going to be at its peak value. So as far as I can see on here, there's no downside short of something catastrophic happening.
My initial reaction to the whole thing was it was actually lower than what I thought. Like, I was kind of on the same vein as what you were saying, Max. Like, I thought, given how aggressive everyone's projecting the cap to increase over the next 5 years or so, that this contract would come in a lot higher. So the fact that the Red Wings lock up Lucas Raymond just over $8 million for 8 years, with the cap going up, Lucas Raymond obviously going to get better, this is quite the deal and quite a value deal for the Red Wings.
Just adding some additional context, credit to Pierre LeBrun, who I believe was one of the first, if not the first to report, but there are no signing bonuses in the deal, and there's a 10-team no trade for when Raymond is actually eligible for that for the last 4 years of the deal. So for half the contract, he can decide a 10-team no trade list. Obviously, Red Wings fans don't want to even think about that, but in terms of the overall deal, it's not just the AAV that seems to be really great. It's pretty friendly to the team in terms of a no trade when it's less than a third of the league that he can eliminate on that list if it does get to that. So before I get into my personal analysis, I would be remiss in not saying a massive thank you to Steve Yzerman. Like, no matter when this Seider contract drops, these guys are laughing because I was just out of the country and not able to record at all for 5 days. Evan, for a period of time that overlapped, was not able to record at all. The Berggren news dropped after this anniversary trip that I had with my wife, who put a lot of time and energy in that to plan it, and probably would have thrown my phone into the Boston Harbor had I tried to ruin it. The Berggren deal didn't drop until I was in the airport coming home, and the Raymond deal didn't drop until today. So, Steve Yzerman, thank you. I will never complain about when you do deals again. But yeah, just to echo you three, I hate to be repetitive here, but just to really emphasize, this is really, really great value. Right now, I think it's really great value just to get that 8-year deal. It's great value to get that at a number that is, barely higher than Seth Jarvis's for total cash, not counting in the deferrals. And it's fantastic to do that considering the big jumps in the cap are still coming. Like, this is just going to age better and better and better. And to transition us into our next point, we have a lot of conversations on this show about, the contract structure. And as Brad was getting into what the team's contention window is, we needle, and we do needle. I'll admit that we needle on contracts. Some of them that are worth it. Some of them we needle, on contracts that are maybe not going to be relevant later on. I firmly believe that when you get the big ones right, that is 80 to 90% of the job. And it's not just, the Dylan Larkin contract that was done right. It's not just the first round picks that Steve Yzerman has done right. This was the first big moment that showed what kind of GM he is able to be for this team in a juncture that will have cascading effects for the next most of a decade. And he showed up. Like, this is a fantastic contract from Steve Yzerman, and this buys a lot of goodwill in terms of, fans wondering about what his cap structure management was going to be like. Like, this is a huge, huge first step in that direction.
I think it was maybe last episode we were talking about the philosophy of you can overpay your stars. They're going to be good, so just don't mess up those bottom six, bottom pairing defenseman type players when you're signing them. And the Red Wings did nothing there. They didn't overpay for Raymond. Like, this is setting them up for excellent cap structure going forward when, someone like Sebastian Cossa or Nate Danielson gets through their ELC and they have to start signing their next contracts.
The thing that really stands out to me too, Ryan, is, we've talked at various points this offseason about, okay, they got to get these Seider and Raymond deals done before July 1 for XYZ reason, because they need to know how much they can spend on other stuff. I'm looking at it now. They have $8.74 million left for Moritz Seider. He should be able to fit into that, even if they were to go a little above Dylan Larkin, which I don't know that they really have to do. But they have room to do that if they needed to get him. And it kind of seems like they nailed the amount they had to set aside pretty much to the dollar. Now, is that because they set aside as much as they were possibly willing to go, and then the players kind of met them in the middle? Could be that the players were willing to come down to what it had to take to play. We don't know exactly how the mechanisms were there, but I do have to give them credit because I thought that was a really dicey bet to have to do your off season without knowing what these two big ticket foundational cap pieces were going to look like. They did it. They set aside the money, and I guess I'll knock on wood here because the Seider deal is not done yet, but it does look like they're going to kind of threaded that needle by the end of this.
And the big thing with contenders when you're looking down the road is every single one of them without fail has a superstar and a great contract. And you need flexibility in that season to add at the deadline. We just watched Edmonton let Broberg and Holloway go, and part of the reasoning was we want to see what this team has and then address those needs at the deadline. And Ryan called it needling, which is probably a good term to use. A lot of Yzerman's work in free agency, but most of those downsides have come and affect the short term. Outside of Andrew Kopp, and he's only got 3 years left, none of the bad contracts bleed into when this is really going to matter. So if you're looking at the long-term future of the Red Wings and the three contracts that are on the team that will still be around and will matter in that window is Larkin, who's at a really good value, Raymond, who's at a really good value, and if they can get Seider for 9 or less, he'll be in at really good value. And those are three foundational pieces that you can build around.
And Brad, I would argue that's even more important, what you just said, for the Red Wings than even other teams, right? Because yes, every team has stars on good contracts. The Red Wings have and I mean this with like all respect to the Red Wings stars, they don't have that top 10 player. So it's even more important that the guys that they do have are good value contracts, because the way that you can kind of catch teams that have that, McDavid, that Draisaitl, that McKinnon player that you maybe don't have, is to have a bunch of really, really good players, stars even, but who are giving you surplus value. And that's the way you try to catch them, because you can't pay your player who's not as good as McKinnon as much as McKinnon and expect to be as good as Colorado, obviously, right? And they were never in that territory with these guys. But to Brad's point, I think, if every team has a guy making 8.5 or 9 or whatever that's really, really good, you got to have your guys a little under that to make up the difference.
And it also leaves open the window if a superstar becomes available. The Red Wings will then have the cap space to go after a guy who's going to require $11+ million a year. So it's all around just great cap management.
It's funny because we talk a lot about who is a true superstar, and I know we had the argument last episode between me, Brad, and Evan, which people got way more heated about afterwards, about where Draisaitl fits and that kind of thing. And very obviously the Red Wings, I fully agree, Max, the Red Wings don't have anyone up there, but this might be too anecdotal. The conversation around the teams with those superstars for the last mini generation here has been who's going to be the first team with a $10 million player to win the cup before Eichel did it. And now inflation is going to answer that question really quickly. But I still think there's so much to be said for, a team that's greater than the sum of their parts. And even if you don't have those true superstars, you can find, and it's almost a better, if not scarier, lane to find success in the NHL. Like if you have a ton of cap dedicated to a small amount of guys, the way the sport's set up, it's not exactly friendly to do so. Like you have to be almost even more efficient as a GM with the rest of your deals to work around that. Now, would Steve Yzerman want to snap his fingers and grab 2 top 10 superstars in an instant and cap be damned? Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to try to pretend the Red Wings are better off for not having, Matthews or McDavid. But still, this is the hand that Yzerman was dealt. You can't have gotten those superstars for all the criticisms that we or others might have had. Getting a Matthews, getting McDavid, whatever, it hasn't been on the table. It's not been possible. So for the lane that was afforded to Yzerman and the Red Wings, this is one of the best possible outcomes so far.
Well, the other benefit of getting all the surplus value is if Raymond signed for essentially 8.1 and at his peak, he's worth 9.5, 10 mil. You get a mil and a half surplus there. If you get Seider for 9 mil, he's worth 10. There's a mil. If Larkin's producing like a 9.5 player, all of a sudden you have 3-4 mil in surplus value from your top 3 players. Let's say Mitch Marner or Mikko Rantanen hit the market. They're $12 million players, but you have to pay them 13 or 14 to get them. Now you're looking at your top 4 with still surplus value, and you have that missing piece that we've been talking about them lacking and maybe never being able to get. It allows that flexibility down the line for when opportunities like that may present themselves.
Or even if you go about it another way, right? Like all the talk in Toronto is about this core 4, right? And Tavares will probably he'll either move on or he'll, have a lesser cap hit, and maybe we talk about it a little differently. But whether it's a core 4 or a core 5, okay, they make that much money. Detroit, if you don't have that, Matthews level player, well, your answer to that has to be to have a core 6 or a core 7. And if you're paying these guys in this kind of range, this $8 to $9 million range, all of a sudden that's possible, because Austin Matthews makes $13 million. And what is Mitch Marner going to make if he extends? And we know what William Nylander's now making. He's in the $11 million range. All of a sudden, Matthews and Nylander aren't going to be that much more combined, just the two of them, than Larkin, Raymond, and Seider. And so you have to try to make it up the numbers game that way by having that many more great players. That's not just a pure depth thing. That we are still talking about great players, about stars even. But if you don't have that superstar, that megastar, whatever you want to call it, you got to make it up by having more great players.
Let's talk about Lucas Raymond's expectations now. He's come a long way as a player. We saw him step up last season in terms of production, working on what kind of ailed him in his sophomore slump, if you even want to call it that, finding space, getting his physicality to be integral to his game. And, last season he really broke through all that. The joke going into camp was that he put on 12 pounds of muscle, and, it became a little bit of a meme, but it was true. Like, you saw it translate into his game, and he became not a transformed player. He became a better version of himself, which that's how star players progress. And it was fantastic to see. What's the next step for him? What are you guys thinking in terms of, point totals, what you want to see continue to grow on the ice? The Red Wings are obviously going to have to lean on him even more. Not that they haven't been already, but, Lucas Raymond's development still has a lot of headroom, as you all alluded to. So what does that look like?
I think it leads to him hopefully being a point per game plus first line winger. The less you have to juggle with a lineup, the more cohesive it gets, the more chemistry can be built. So if you can look at this Red Wings team for the next, 5, 6, 7, 8 years and just staple Dylan Larkin at 1C, staple Lucas Raymond at, one of the first line wing spots, and then you build around that, it makes things simple and it allows a player like Raymond to elevate his game even further because it's not a constant switch around. It's not learning new chemistry. It's not learning new players. We saw what him and Larkin did with DeBrincat all of last year. DeBrincat's got 3 years left. Might not be a whole lot of reason to change that. And all of a sudden, if you got DeBrincat popping off for 30, 35 goals, Raymond popping off for 80 plus points, again, it's about building that foundation for the future. And that's a good step because look at the last 10 years of the Red Wings. You know what this team has desperately lacked? Any consistency in any department outside of Dylan Larkin himself. So honestly, as long as Raymond can bring that, the point total is kind of secondary to me.
Yeah, if we're talking point totals, I was just taking a quick look, and if he's a point per game player, he's one of the top 6 right wingers in the NHL. So if he can get to that spot, obviously that's fantastic for fans, but management will be happy as well because they'll be seeing the progression of Lucas Raymond into a budding superstar, but they'll also be seeing the contract and how much value they're getting out of that.
And I think it could happen as soon as this year, guys. I think with the way he finished, obviously the shooting percentage is what it is. It was not a sustainable shooting percentage to end the year, but Raymond also had less shots on goal last year than he did as a rookie. I think he can up that number quite easily to make up for the lost, shooting percentage, the expected shooting percentage regression. And at that point, I don't think it's unreasonable to think this is a guy that can be a point per game player or an 80-point player this coming year, especially you got the familiarity now with Larkin and DeBrincat. I would love to see that trio play together all year with the way they finished. And I think, just having that familiarity where you can pick up where you left off, is huge.
I think you're exactly right, Max. One thing that is still part of his game that I want him to shed that we've seen since his rookie season, trust your shot more. He didn't take a lot of shots, and that's not because he wasn't in a position or because, he was always looking past first. He took that extra beat, or he did try to force the pass sometimes when I thought, you have a wicked shot. You don't always need the perfect amount of screen. You don't always need the perfect angle. I think part of building the strength led to a better shot, but then the confidence in that was another thing. So for him to produce as much as he did while still having that headroom, that's what we're talking about in terms of Lucas Raymond still having more room to grow. That shot can be way better in terms of volume and effectiveness.
And I should say, he has upped the shot attempts, right? So it's the shots on goal that we're talking about. So maybe it's a matter of kind of just hitting the net a little bit more. But I would like to see him, in terms of shots on goal, more in the territory of where Dylan Larkin is. I think Raymond had 163 shots on goal last season. Dylan Larkin had 221. So imagine if you could add almost, 40% the number of shots on goal to Lucas Raymond's total this coming season. And I think that more than counteracts any shooting percentage stuff.
Another thing is the Red Wings have a much better offensive lineup than they've had in years past, but they still have some questions to answer. I'm a big fan of JT Compher. I think he's done what the Red Wings needed from him. I think he's done anything that could be reasonably expected from him and a little bit more. At the same time, there's some questions still to answer. How much offense can come from his wingers if he's centering that second line? I know Kane has been skating with him in this offseason, and that could, be fruitful for them, but driving that line is going to have to come from the wing. And if Raymond's on the first line, that's great. Then obviously we're excited to see that. Max, you mentioned that trio with Larkin and DeBrincat together. But if Raymond's on the second line and he can drive that line, then that would be huge for them as well, because the answer in terms of, driving the play and finding Patrick Kane at the right point on the ice, it might not and probably won't come from JT Compher. So Lucas Raymond has extra shouldered responsibility. We talk about him not being a center. In terms of what the Red Wings need from him, in some ways, they kind of do need him to be one.
Yeah, and I get what you mean. Like, you're not asking him to literally play center, even though that is a conversation I've heard a few people on Twitter throw out a few more times than I think makes any sense. But you are going to kind of ask him to be your driving force from the wing if that would be his deployment, right? I think Dylan Larkin can more than handle that job and really let Lucas Raymond hunt shots and hunt plays when Larkin's the center. But when he plays with Compher, and I think you're going to see a bunch of different looks from the Red Wings this year, then yeah, I think Lucas is going to be the guy on that line. And he is going to be tasked with kind of, seeing the ice, and the play will kind of run through him. And I definitely think you saw enough the second half of last year, including when Larkin was out. The team wasn't good enough when Larkin was out, but especially the last few games of that stretch, it was Raymond who really stepped forward and looked like the guy who could do that. And I think, if anything, that just kind of shows him that he can do it. It's not really about showing us. It's about getting that instinct into his mind that when, he is the best player on the ice, he needs to dictate and he needs to look like it. And I think last year showed he could do it. And I think he showed to himself that way too.
Okay, before we talk about Seider, let's spend some time here on Jonatan Berggren. We knew he would be signed. We talked on this podcast quite a bit in the episodes leading up that, it would be a short-term deal for very little money because that's just the position he was in. This is a prove-it deal for Berggren, signing a 1-year, $825,000 contract. He can't go through to Grand Rapids without going through waivers, and so, he has to earn his spot on the roster still, yes, but the Red Wings are also just not going to give him away for free. So what does this mean for Berggren specifically? And we'll get into how his cap hit combined with Raymond's talks about Seider after the break. But for Berggren, this contract, this upcoming year, what's up for him?
Well, obviously, like you said, it's a prove-it deal. I think the comparisons he's going to be up against are going to be a little unfair because he's not technically a rookie, but still very young in his NHL career. The top six is pretty well solidified. But when you look in the bottom six right now, there is not a lot of scoring options. There's no more Robbie Fabry. There's no more Daniel Sprong. And those are going to be the standards he's likely going to be held to because that's the role he's going to be playing. If he does it well, where his big opportunity could come is if there's an injury in the top six and they want to keep a scoring winger or whatever up there, it might be his to gain. We've seen the Red Wings do that in the past to some successes and some failures, and it's going to fall on his shoulders because the offense has to come in the bottom six from somewhere if the Red Wings are going to be competitive for a playoff spot this year. And that's not to say Rasmussen and Veleno and Kopp and all those guys are completely devoid of goals. There's going to be goals, but everybody knows Berggren's not here for his defensive value. Everybody knows exactly what his strengths are, and he needs to show that at the NHL level. And unless, again, something goes wrong injury-wise, he's not going to get that look in the top six. So he's going to have to make do with what he's going to get.
Yeah, I think for him, the whole conversation just comes down to the ice time and what are the opportunities he's getting and is he ready to make the most of it, right? We've seen really talented players on the Red Wings and, we can all look at it and say, oh, but if they got more ice time, but it's about what do you do in the ice time that you have? And that's ultimately how you get more ice time. And I do think you're right, Brad. I don't think Berggren can expect to get like a consistent top six deployment, but I do think there's a chance he gets some second power play deployment. And so do what you do there. Show enough that you're willing to kind of adapt to, you don't have to do a quintessential bottom six style of play, but that kind of sheltered scoring line style, bottom six line that we see become increasingly popular. Red Wings had one last year, right? Like, I think you want a little more defensive impact than you got out of Daniel Sprong, but that's kind of an example for how a fourth line can still be in offensive situations, not just be pure checkers, and try to make the most out of the minutes that they get.
The second power play too might even be limited because if they're going to load up, Kane, DeBrincat, Larkin, and Raymond on that first unit with either Gustafsson or Seider, I think a lot of fans are going to be begging that unit to stay on the ice for a minute and a half to the full 2 minutes every time they're out there. So even that might be pretty limited opportunity if he's running one of the flanks on the second power play unit.
But that's not bad though, right? Like, I think the NHL has trended in that direction where you keep your first unit on and you load it up if you have the talent to do it. But the power plays that really stand out are the ones where guys who have 30 to 42 seconds or whatever it is, they are on and they're efficient. And we've seen Berggren be efficient. I always think about, he knows where to be. He has a nose for the net. He hangs around kind of the right side of the crease. He buries them. He has that offensive sense. And so I don't think it's a bad thing if you're if Berggren's not getting a world of opportunity in the power play because he's on the second power play, if he's efficient. Max, you're talking about that kind of sheltered bottom six role while still being offensive. It's not apples to apples with Sprong. I know they're different players, but the Red Wings are going to hope that Berggren is Sprong without the trust issues that they had with him on the ice. He was a liability on the ice, and as the season progressed, in the Red Wings' view and a lot of fans' view, the good didn't outweigh the bad, even though there are some big moments in our mind. So for me, with Berggren, as you guys have talked about, if he can work on the other aspects of his game that aren't purely from the offensive blue line in, he can carve out a spot. Like, yes, there's a lot of traffic in front of him in terms of roster players. And yeah, there are a lot of other prospects who are going to be competing for that time. But if the Red Wings can have a more effective Daniel Sprong, and it doesn't have to be with more offense, it could be just with less liability, then that's his niche. And then anything else is gravy.
And I think people are going to hear that, Ryan, and think that you're saying, oh, well, why would Berggren need to be like this checker and go take the pucks off people? That's not his game. I don't even really think that's what it's about. I don't think the Red Wings are going to ask him to be Andrew Kopp. I think what it's about is do not turn the puck over and be clean on your breakouts and your exits, right? You have to be reliable with the puck on your stick. That's still a defensive kind of question, right? Of not turning the puck over, being able to get the puck out and, avoid the danger and get the change or whatever that might be. Like, I still lump that in with like defense and 200-foot play. Even if it is happening in the offensive zone, it's don't turn the puck over on, making a fancy move at the offensive blue line and give up an odd man rush. So I think it's even more about that than it is anything to do with like literal capital D defense. Go stop this guy one-on-one. I think it's more to do with not putting your defense in tough situations.
Just comes down to being harder to play against, right? Like, he doesn't have to go blow guys up in the corner or make crazy plays. Like, he just has to be reliable, and he just has to be more difficult to play against than his opponents, which I think he can do. Like, he's coming in after an impressive year in Grand Rapids, being the guy. Like, he should have all the momentum and all the confidence to carve out a spot on the Red Wings.
You're both exactly right, Max and Evan, and I'm really happy, Max, that you went into the details on that, because there's a lot of generalization when you talk about a 200-foot player. And yeah, you don't need everyone to be the platonic ideal of Andrew Kopp or the old school 200-foot player. Like, not everyone's going to be Chris Draper at his peak, but I think what you've seen the NHL trend back towards is, yes, skill is good. Yes, offense is good, but you are not going to win meaningfully. And you can think about the Leafs if you want to use an example, or you think about a star player who just doesn't show up in the playoffs. You are not going to win meaningfully unless every single player on the ice is responsible in every single zone. You're going to do different things. Some guys are going to have more offensive acumen. Some guys are going to be absolute stalwarts in their own zone. But whatever you're doing, make sure that you are not burning your defense. You're not burning your goalies. You're not leaving your center and your wingers out of position. That is what we mean when you hear 200-foot player. It doesn't mean everyone has to just go out and, take out bodies or break up passes like Nick Lidstrom used to, or whatever it is. It's just within the scope of what's the sufficient standard to being an NHL player. That's what I think Steve Yzerman and Derek Lalonde are working towards. Jonatan Berggren, 1 year, $825,000 contract. Lucas Raymond, very exciting, 8-year extension, the maximum possible term. Steve Yzerman locks him up for 8.075 AAV. Lots more to come, because Mo Seider is the next question, but first we're going to hear from the sponsors of the Winged Wheel podcast. Hockey fans, the new season is calling. Fuel up for it with Factor's no prep, no mess meals. Meet your wellness goals in time for puck drop thanks to the menu of chef-crafted meals with options like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. So no matter how crazy it gets following the on-ice action, you'll always have time to enjoy nutritious, great-tasting meals. Make today the day you kickstart a new healthy routine. What are you waiting for? Treat yourself to restaurant-quality meals that feature premium ingredients like filet mignon, shrimp, and blackened salmon. And you keep kitchen time to a minimum. Factor meals are ready in 2 minutes. No shopping, prepping, cooking, or cleaning up, so you can enjoy effortless support for your lifestyle. Choose from 6 menu preferences to help you manage calories, maximize protein intake, avoid meat, or simply eat a well-balanced meal. Head to factormeals.com/wingedwheel50 and use code wingedwheel50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month. That's code wingedwheel50 at factormeals.com/wingedwheel50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. Welcome back. You know, the excitement of Lucas Raymond and what his contract could mean, that most days would be an entire episode, but we had to cut that conversation a little bit short, and there's going to be a lot to come on Lucas Raymond because, Max, you led into this. Moritz Seider's contract is the last domino to fall, and it is arguably the biggest one. Some might have said that if you had to pick between him and Raymond, his number's likely going to be higher. There's bigger implications. There's more variability in terms of whether the Red Wings are going to go to bridge versus not. Steve Yzerman and the Red Wings management almost carved out exactly what they can give Moritz Seider on his next deal if it is going to be an 8-year contract. So what do the signals tell you about what might be coming for Seider and what's left for him?
Well, we talked on the Raymond contract here about kind of the comparables. And just so people know, I'm sure most people do know, but in case you don't, that's kind of like the main framework for how like contract negotiations go through is, you know, you go, okay, well, this guy got paid this and these were his stats and these are my client's stats or my stats. And so I should be above him. And, you know, you kind of work off those. And then the team says, well, this guy got paid this and, you know, your stats are here relative to him. So we want you below him. Right. So, the reason those are important is because they set the framework for these contracts. And I think there was a really crucial contract signed this summer for the Moritz Seider framework, and that was Brock Faber. Brock Faber, really similar profile to Moritz Seider, defense first defenseman, still able to produce some offense. I think he had 47 points in 82 games this year. That's pretty similar to what Mo Seider's been doing for his whole career. In his rookie year when he won the Calder, it was 50 points, right? And Faber's only played the 1 year. Seider's played 3 full years of being one of the most durable, mean players in the NHL, taking the toughest minutes in the NHL last season. I think he's got to be above Faber's number, which was 8 years times $8.5 million. So I think it's got to start there on an 8-year deal. But the Red Wings have $8.74 million to work with. So, now you're really into a narrow band of what this deal could look like. And it probably comes down to, is he become the highest paid player above Dylan Larkin, even by a decimal point? Does he go right up and match Larkin? And now you have your captain and your, you know, kind of star defense pillar making the same money. You kind of set a little bit of an internal cap ceiling, or does it go one under that even and, you know, 8.6, and kind of show a little bit of deference to Larkin? We're really into a narrow band here though, guys, unless the Red Wings are going to, waive somebody and play with 22, on the roster this year. There's a pretty narrow band. I think he's got to be above Faber, and I think obviously he's got to be below the cap ceiling.
That's what the Red Wings are going to say. If I'm Claude Lemieux, I'm saying I don't care about an internal cap. And he's done 3 years of what Brock Faber did in 1. And I don't think Brock Faber has the physical element that Seider brings. So it's going to be an interesting, you know, ceiling, because how many NHL defensemen have we seen go well over 9 mil? And I'm not saying Seider is better than, you know, all of them, but he's better than 1 or 2 of them at least, and younger. And obviously that is not as many UFA years as some of those contracts, but I am genuinely curious, because what I'm thinking right now is if Seider comes in at Larkin's number or lower, he's just straight up doing the Red Wings a solid at that point, because again, like you said, comparables are everything. And I think the 3 years versus the 1 year of Brock Faber is not worth, you know, $200,000. I would think if I'm in his camp, I'm saying there is way more certainty with Mo Seider than Brock Faber. We want to be paid accordingly. And even the UFA years, it's only a couple of years difference, 1 or 2, but still that matters in contract negotiations. So, and I've even seen the opinion floating around today, well, Raymond and Seider are equal talent, so shouldn't that bring it down? You can say they're equal talent or Raymond's even better, but it's a winger versus a right-handed shot number 1 defenseman. There is no comparable on their contracts realistically.
There's so many different angles to take here. Like, for all you know, Lemieux and Seider are saying, well, yeah, we want the full 8.748 or whatever it is. And Steve Yzerman saying, well, Lucas Raymond's at under 8.1, so why should you get more than, let's say, 8.35? And that's just conjecture. That's not based on information. Like, Yzerman got Raymond's number sub 8.1. So it stands to reason that he's not going to leave any penny on the table in terms of saving as much cap space as possible. We, for the most part, preach on this podcast, if you have to overpay, pay your stars and superstars and don't overpay for middle of the lineup. But a good and a smart GM says, well, no, you don't overpay anyone. And that's why Steve Yzerman has a reputation for grinding the most important players like Larkin. Raymond came in just under the wire before camp, and we don't know when Seider is going to come in. And if it is 8.748 or 8.7 at Larkin, for me, it's less about, he's not worth 8.9, but he is worth 8.75. For me, I think an achievement would be using Larkin as that internal cap, because if you're going to go above Larkin and Seider doesn't, that means that whatever future player you're bringing in, that is a superstar, and that's the only justification. So the internal cap, the agents are wise to it, and they don't really, allow it as much as they used to. But if the Red Wings get him in there, or even the 8.748 or whatever it is, or you buy some cap space, like Max said, you waive someone and send him to Grand Rapids, the Red Wings are really well positioned here for a few reasons. One, I fully agree. I think this is enough money left for Seider. Two, you saved a ton, in my mind, on Lucas Raymond, as we've talked about. And three, honestly, if you told me back in April that Mo Seider was going to sign for anything with less than a 9, and it hasn't happened yet, and we don't know that that's going to be the case, but if the Red Wings can do that and his number starts with 8, that's a win. Whatever you have to do, even if it comes above Larkin, whatever, that's a win. The Red Wings have a lot of paths forward here to have both of their star RFAs locked up in a way that really, really helps them for max term, if that's the way they go.
All right, so let's like game theory this though, really. So like you say 9, right? Who's the comp at 9?
Cale Makar. He's at 9.
And he's not Makar, right? And that was a 6-year deal, so that also matters. To me, like 9 is the percent of cap equivalent for Miro Heiskanen. And I think Red Wings fans would love to believe that Seider's Miro Heiskanen. He may not be that far off Miro Heiskanen, but are we ready to say that he's like that's the comp here?
No, I'm not saying Miro Heiskanen. If I'm, Seider's camp, what I'm probably trying to angle, and I obviously doubt Yzerman's going to agree, is I would say Seider's equivalent, probably better than Seth Jones and Darnell Nurse. And you make the trade-off that they ate up more UFA years, but Seider's a better player. So that would be the argument I'm making in terms of comparable defensemen who are currently over 9 mil. Charlie McAvoy probably is not a great comp in terms of talent, because I think McAvoy's a bit better than Seider, but I think they're comparable enough. The only difference there was McAvoy signed his 9 point, whatever it was, after a bridge deal, whereas Seider's coming straight out of an ELC. So that would probably mitigate that comparison a little bit.
Yeah. And I think all the comparables, like, I think in order for really a comparable to be relevant in a negotiation like this, it has to be the same circumstances. Right? I don't think you can do the like, okay, yeah, they're UFAs, but he's better, because then he's just not a comparable if it's not the same circumstances. So McAvoy after a bridge, Nurse and Jones, UFA, like I don't even think those are going to come up in this deal. I think they're going to be talking about Jake Sanderson. They're going to be talking about Owen Power. They're going to be talking about Brock Faber, and they're probably going to be talking about Heiskanen. And I think that's kind of the parameters there. So I think, like, to me, 9's a ceiling. 9's like, they got Heiskanen as the comparable, and that deal ended up, percent of cap wise. Heiskanen's 8.45, but it was 4 years ago when the cap was $6 million lower. You do a percent of cap thing, and that brings it out to just over 9. If the Red Wings get what they want, then it's going to be right at Faber, because there's just no way you can go below Faber. Seider has a better resume than Faber, and Faber got 8.5, in my view, at least. To me, 8.5 is where it's like, he did them a favor. It's a hometown deal. And so I think it comes in somewhere in there. And what do you know? The amount of cap room they have left is the exact middle between 9 and 8.5.
True or false, Lucas Raymond signing for that number gives Yzerman a leg to stand on to say, hey, Mo, you're tight with Lucas. He helped the team out on an 8-year deal. He wants to win. Now I expect you to do the same.
Whether it gives him that leg or not, I bet he's going to say it, right? Like, I think that's what you're trying to do when you're organizing these contracts here, is you're trying to have everybody take a little less. That's the kind of the culture of, I did a story on this when the Red Wings, before they even hired Yzerman, I believe, because his shadow like loomed over that whole year, because he had announced that he was stepping back. And I went to Tampa and I talked to some of those guys, and sacrifice was kind of the culture that they created. Everybody takes a little bit less and they get something out of it. And I absolutely think that's what the Red Wings are trying to foster. That I almost guarantee that that's going to come up And whether it's related to the Raymond deal or not, I'm sure that it's part of the conversation.
Well, we're looking at this number, what's left in the cap, and we're saying, oh God, that is a Seider shaped hole in the wall for him to plug into, and that is your cap structure. And the only questions left going into the season are, what's going to happen with the roster because the influx of goalies. What if a young guy kicks down the door? Blah blah blah. That is assuming an 8-year deal, though. We're riding a high because Lucas Raymond signed that 8-year deal, and obviously Mo Seider, to the knowledge that we have, would prefer a long-term contract. Like, he very much the same mind as Lucas Raymond, wants to be a Red Wing for his whole life and wants to be part of a winning team and has bought into, the culture that Steve Yzerman, Derek Lalonde, and Dylan Larkin, everyone have built in Hockeytown. It could not be an 8-year deal. They might have way more cap space than we anticipate because this could still be a bridge with the obvious this is never happening of you don't walk him right to unrestricted free agency like you did with the Toronto Maple Leafs Stars, which is bearing fruit now in the worst way. But still, could this still be a bridge deal? And is that still on the table? Or does this signal to you that no, it's going to follow suit with Raymond? Everything adds up too much for a long-term one.
I got to assume it's going to be an 8-year, 7-year, obviously Lucas and Mo are tight. It would make sense that they kind of have the same vision, the same interests in mind. Raymond takes an 8-year deal. I would be surprised if it ended up at a bridge deal at this point, just because I like the phrase of Moritz Seider shaped hole in the Red Wings cap space, because that is very convenient. And his best friend on the team just signed 8 years. And how often do we see players in the NHL do this? Constantly. They always try to stay in the same range because they want to build something together. Now, that's by no means guarantee, and that is all pure conjecture, but it has been a trend in hockey for a while. All indications between these two make it seem like that could be something they are interested in. But ultimately, if Yzerman's pushing 8-year, and they just cannot come to terms on an AAV, then, bridge might be the fallback.
I think Brad said it. It feels like a Moritz Seider shaped hole, and I can't ignore that, right? Like, why? I guess other than being able to pay Patrick Kane's bonuses out of this year's cap and not next year's, I don't know why at this point you wouldn't use the remaining cap you have to make sure that you get your, franchise defenseman locked up long term. I don't think a bridge for him at the start of the summer felt like the most implausible or worst idea, because unlike Raymond, it is hard for me to see him adding like 15 points to his point total in one of the next 2 years. It's not impossible, especially if he got PP1. But barring that, like, it just doesn't feel as likely. And so the number felt like it would be pretty similar no matter what it was, although with the cap rising, it can change. At that point, though, why even risk it, right? If there is a chance that he's going to end up PP1 and he's going to add 10 points, you're going to kick yourself if you sign him for 2 years just to save $2 million to pay Kane's bonuses when the cap was going to go up next year anyway. You might as well do the long term.
And to me, you have room at the bottom of the lineup with those guys. You waive whoever. You make that work. That's not hard to do with that amount of money. The general thinking mathematically and philosophy-wise when you're building a team is you sign your young stars who are only going to get better for as long as possible. That's what we've been talking about this whole episode. And we said with Mo Seider that you're running the risk of having to pay him more by waiting beyond July 1 of last season. This is a unique situation where I don't think that kind of MO doesn't hold true anymore, but with Seider, the Red Wings almost put themselves in a better position, which other teams wouldn't have been able to do because they don't have a good decor around Seider. He has to shoulder what were the hardest minutes in deployment in the NHL by far for several years going back, and his point total suffered. Max, you said at the top of the show, contracts and dollars in AAV, that's typically rewarded for points and output as caveman thinking as you think that might be. And Seider went from a 50-point high in his first year to 42 points for the next 2 seasons. And I don't think that's because he got worse offensively. I think that's because he was carrying the entire team on his back. And so have the Red Wings, I'm not saying that it was done intentionally. I think they would have loved to have better D-men around Seider, but have the Red Wings lucked into a situation where they time this as well as possible, where he doesn't have the offensive output to justify a contract that starts with a 9, even though he is still that player right now.
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to. That's the toughest thing, is that so often these contracts do seem to come down to points, and we have so many more stats, and we see hockey in such a more nuanced way than points. And yet you look at the contracts and it feels like it's points at the end of the day. And that makes it kind of tricky, but that kind of is how it feels, isn't it?
It's that meme where it's like the guy who's a mouth breather, the angry guy in the middle, and the guy with like the wise guy with the hood, and the two ends are saying contracts are all about points, and the guy in the middle is like, no, you have to go for expected whatever above replacement per 60. It's us Weasley podcast people just galaxy
100%.
printing it. Yeah. So with Seider and the anticipation that it's likely going to be 8 years, with the caveat that anything can change, it's Steve Yzerman, no one has solid information. Is anyone brave enough to make a prediction on what this comes in at?
I'm going to go on a limb and say 8.74.
Every penny of the cap gone.
Yeah.
Honestly, I would respect that move so deeply if that's what they actually did.
I'm going to say, unless it's like an 8.53 thing and he does the jersey number, I'm going to say 8.7 to bring him right up to Larkin. I mean, if this team was extremely funny, 8.69 would be amazing in a lot of ways, but I'll say 8.7, and then that solidifies the internal cap and it solves the problem of Mo Seider, obviously wanting a lot more.
You're really going to give him the Sidney Crosby amount of money, eh?
Well, many people are making that comparison.
Talking about points, they are the same. You're right. Yeah, I was thinking 8.7 as well long term. I think that makes a lot of sense for player and team. That's kind of where I fall in with that one.
Yeah, I'll just be the parrot here. I think 8.7 makes sense. Honestly, 8.6 would have made sense too, but now it would almost be like, why are you nickel and diming me over? I know that money's there. Like, let's just set this number right at Dylan, or maybe 8.69 if he wanted to show a little bit of deference to the captain. But the money's there. I don't see why they wouldn't spend it.
So one other thing I'll talk about before we throw to Max to talk about the prospect mini tournament that happened, which poor Max came in so prepared today with so much. But visas and NHL players, don't think that because they are multimillionaires and they're playing in the NHL that it's fast. I think actually since COVID, things have gotten slower. It's not as bad as it's always been, but you still see players with trouble sometimes. So, guys who are in Europe without contracts, they don't always get their visas the quickest. So with Raymond, we'll see when he can actually get over, but it's good to have him at least done before training camp. With Seider, depending on that timing, you could still be looking at, missed time at training camp. But regardless, over that administrative hurdle, it is good to have at the very least Berggren and Raymond done before training camp because you minimize any kind of loss of form coming into the season.
I think I saw a photo that someone posted of like Berggren's Insta story at a Tigers game. So maybe there is a way to get these guys over here. I think that was even before his contract was signed. So I guess, immigration once again remains a mystery of when it goes fast and when it doesn't.
Well, let's let the powers that be and the rubber stampers do their job. And Max, let's give you some time to talk about the hard work that you put in covering the Red Wings. It used to be a prospect tournament, but now it's 2 games against the Dallas Stars prospects that happened over the weekend ahead of actual training camp kicking off. What did you see? What did you notice? What do the Red Wings have in the pipeline to look forward to?
Yeah, and it was a little bit of a thinner prospect roster. It was a thinner tournament in general. Obviously, everybody knows this year it was not the 8 teams that it used to be, or even the 4 teams that it had shrunk down to up at the Traverse City event. It was just Detroit and Dallas, and there was a lot less of the prospects, ton of invitees in those games, but a few really big names. Nate Danielson and Michael Brandsegg-Nygard, obviously the biggest. Brandsegg-Nygard only played in the first of the 2 games. He had a groin tweak. He told me he felt like he was 100%, but the staff wanted to be cautious, even though he felt fine. So I take that to mean he'll be full go on Thursday. And I thought he was good. He unleashed the big shot a couple times. I think you might have wanted to see that even a little bit more, but one of them led to a easy rebound that Jakub Brklovsky cleaned up for a goal. And I thought he overall was good. He could have been, more impactful. There's no doubt, but for his first game, in North America, I thought it was pretty good. I did think it was interesting. I got a chance to talk to him, and this really stood out to me. He mentioned that in Norway, some of the rinks there are NHL ice. They're not all Olympic. And in fact, I think he said the rink that he played on a lot growing up was NHL ice. So it won't be a totally unfamiliar thing for him whenever that comes. I do get the sense that if he's not in Detroit, maybe he would kind of prefer Sweden, but that's obviously a decision that'll get made at the end of camp, and I'm sure Steve Yzerman will have a say in that. So we will see where that goes. But I thought it was a pretty good start for him. I think you just saw why the Red Wings like him. A ton of mature details, huge body that he's not afraid to use, huge shot that he's not afraid to use. That all adds up pretty quickly into a really useful player.
Thought his passing looked really good as well in the first game. Something, that we probably overlooked a little bit in his draft profile. We just see this guy with this massive shot blowing other guys up in the league. But I thought his passing and his attention to detail, like you said, was excellent.
So we'll link to Max's piece that he put in The Athletic in the description of this episode. Of course, you have to go read that. But Max, did you find anything in there that kind of tipped you off as to what good problems the Red Wings might have, if any, at training camp? Because like I alluded to before, a lot of NHL level players, a lot of players who could likely make the jump, not enough spots in the Red Wings roster this season.
Well, I think you're alluding to Nate Danielson, right? And Nate obviously had a fantastic preseason last year. I don't know that it was ever realistic that he was going to make the team, but he was one of the last guys sent home. Whether that was a result of, actually being in contention or just let's keep this guy up for as long as possible, who knows? But he was really good while he was up. And I think if he's that good again, it does become a difficult conversation. And I thought, his first period at the first game, quiet, and then built the second, good in the third, and I thought really good the whole second game. I was looking through my notebook at the end of that, counting up. I think I had like 4 really good chances created for teammates by him, plus a post that he hit, plus a skilled move that he didn't quite finish off. He had an empty net goal that got waved off for a teammate being offside. So he ends with 1 assist, but I ended up feeling like he created quite a bit of offensive chances. If he does that again, if he puts the puck in the net, obviously that's a bottom line. It can't just be he looks good all the time and doesn't score, so let's put him on the team. But if he's able to look good and produce, I really do wonder what could happen, because in theory the roster looks full, and this would go for Carter Mazur and Marco Kasper as well, who were not at this event. But since we're talking about this event, I really do wonder, like, how good does he have to be to knock somebody out of it? I think it would have to be a top 9 job. I don't see the Red Wings keeping him up to play on the 4th line and 10 minutes a night. But how good would it really have to be? I think it should be in play, because I think based on what he did last preseason, if he can build on that, I think he can help him.
I think in general, the Red Wings have shown time and time again, no matter how much we galaxy brain it, the answer is really, 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 really good. But you are getting into a phase now where you have more than one guy trying to accomplish the same role. Like if I'm Joe Veleno, I'm thinking, what's my long-term future on this team? And the Red Wings might be thinking the same thing, because it's not just, Nate Danielson. What if Marco Kasper can come in and accomplish the same thing and Joe Veleno can garner something in a trade? And that's just one example. I'm not talking about, the veteran UFAs that you can just waive or trade or, let their contracts expire, whatever it might be. But you're getting into a phase now where you have enough good players. Your roster's not filled out with has-beens and wash-ups and people essentially just to fill your roster. All this lends me to think that if a player kicks down the door, even if they can't justify the roster spot day one, this might be when you start to see strategic moves made and tough decisions to cut players loose to make room for a guy. Because what's the best case scenario for the Red Wings this year? They have their second line center solution answered internally. And that, I'm talking pie in the sky. No one can hold Nate Danielson to that expectation. No one can hold, Brandsegg-Nygard to like being a top 6 winger this year expectation. Like I'm talking best possible outcome. But man, if you think that he can do it, then you kind of have to move heaven and earth to make that happen for the team. Losses of other good players be damned, right?
So there is a line that I've kind of kicked around in my head that I think is the actual literal perfect line for Nate Danielson to break into the NHL on. And that is with JT Compher and Patrick Kane. Both of those players are on the Red Wings on the second line. And while I don't think Danielson would be able to be the full-time 2C there right away, I think you'd have to give Compher a lot of that and kind of work him in where you could. I just think the complements there are kind of perfect. You have this elite offensive, mind and player in Patrick Kane who can, kind of coach Danielson up and play with him and show him some things, but also be in wherever Danielson needs him to be, find Danielson wherever he happens to be. Compher can cover up so many mistakes that anybody makes. I just think that'd be a great situation. The problem is I don't know how that line ends up being the best second line for the Red Wings and really just the best overall lineup for the Red Wings, because then what you do with Tarasenko, who you gave this, not a massive contract to, but a meaningful contract to. And then are you going to stick him in tough matchups with Andrew Kopp and Michael Rasmussen? I don't think that's kind of the ideal situation for Tarasenko. You're not going to stick him with that kind of contract on the fourth line. So it just kind of jumbles things in a weird way that, I think those line mates would be perfect for him. And I just don't know if it's makes for the overall best situation for the Red Wings. But I definitely think that there's a path, a year from now to Danielson playing in a similar kind of role like that. It's just a matter of making all the pieces fit.
I think with Danielson, because I agree with you, that would be Danielson's best case scenario, but I don't think the team would love that. I think if one of Danielson, Kasper, or Mazur, and Danielson, given his skill set's probably the best fit for this, would be they play on that third line, and I always call it the Thomas Vanek role, where they get very favorable offensive zone starts. They don't play tough matchups. They get some power play time. They're not playing 18 minutes a game, but they're also not playing 8 minutes a game. And you pair Danielson with Berggren and then Kopp or Rasmussen or someone that is going to be reliable, do their job, not going to be someone that's going to drag it down and can, do the stuff that those guys probably aren't going to be great at. And if they're getting the other team's third and fourth lines consistently, they might not be getting caved, even though there's essentially two rookies on that line and a vet that, whoever it ends up being is probably not the most talented player. We've seen success with those types of lines in the past. Can you shelter a rookie that much in the NHL anymore? I'm not so sure, but if they did keep one of the guys on the roster, specifically Danielson, that would be the path I think they would most likely take.
And I think Mazur kind of fits with those guys too. Like, he's got kind of the jam, and, Christian Fischer has fit well with Kopp and Rasmussen. I think Mazur could kind of do that and bring a little more offense. The thing about Danielson, to your point though, Brad, what has that line lacked above all else? Speed. Nate Danielson's going to be one of the fastest players on the Red Wings whenever he makes the team. So I do think that's an interesting idea.
One thing to keep in mind as well is with the team continually to be older and older every year, it feels like there's going to be injuries, right? Like, some of these guys are going to be first called up. There could be injuries in training camp this week that necessitate Danielson or Kasper making the lineup right away. So I do like the experiment idea of having Kasper, Danielson on the third line, shelter them a little bit, see what they can do down there, and obviously move them up the lineup if they're playing well. So yeah, I think there is spots for them if they have a great camp. It remains to be seen so far.
All right, Max, I guess that this is like our first, I didn't even announce this properly just to show how casual we are about this. To wrap up your first ever Good in the Room segment, which already is off of our planned structure, any other parting thoughts without spoiling all of your great article that you wrote up about the Prospect Mini Tournament?
Well, no one's going to read it now that the Raymond deal happened, so I don't mind throwing it all out there. I thought the other guy I really wanted to mention was Emmett Finnie, and I think he's a 7th round pick who signed a contract a year later, and that obviously gets your attention. He had a good dev camp, and now he has a really good prospect tournament. He has a highlight reel assist on the first game where he, takes a puck that kind of bounced off of Liam Bichel, the 1st round pick, gets around him, then cuts to the middle and beats Christian Kyrou, who was a 2nd round pick, and then makes a play that ends up being, I believe it was the winning goal in that game. The next night, he gets a one-timer from the right circle and he scores the game-winning goal in that game. Like, whatever it is about this kid, he seems to kind of have a feel for the moment. He's not just this offensive player. He does have a responsible game that I think will kind of endear him to coaches and give him opportunities. It's too early and there's too much more to see to like proclaim anything here. I do think there's we're seeing the developing of a find here in the 7th round. Maybe we're not going to go steal quite yet, but I think there's a find there.
All right. That's been Good in the Room with Max Bultman. First time he ever did it. We had to ruin it by pushing it to the end of the episode. Max jokes about no one reading the article. When you're done reading the article that he wrote about Lucas Raymond, please go and read that one as well at @M_Bultman on Twitter. Follow him. Click the links to the articles from there. That's where you're going to subscribe to The Athletic Detroit. Always, always, always worth the price of admission. Let's jump into overtime on this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast. Overtime is brought to you by our Patreon supporters, patreon.com/Winged Wheel Podcast. If you want to support the show, you allow us to do things like record these episodes with Max Bultman of the Athletic Detroit featuring in a recurring segment. You allow us to host Winged Wheel Podcast nights in partnership with the Detroit Red Wings and the Grand Rapids Griffins. You allow us to support the Jamie Daniels Foundation through the initiatives that I just mentioned and other ones. You allow us to continue to make this show bigger and better. So many great things. And you get access to the bonus episodes, the bonus overtimes, the giveaways, the tickets, the Discord, all that, lots more. So again, patreon.com/Winged Wheel Podcast. Let's start with a funny question here. We talked about it at the top of the show, but Chimkim Nugget says, how far into today's episode did you make it before the Razor news dropped? Again, we were due to be, 30-ish minutes into it. So thankfully, a delay in baggage claim helped us out. So we struck gold on this one. This is the inverse of what happened with the Alex DeBrincat contract. This one from Avery Sloppy Second says, assuming Seider and Raymond get signed, and Raymond was signed, how likely do the three, let's make it four, of you believe the Red Wings make a conference final with Steve Yzerman as the GM? Number of years does not matter. So assuming the RFAs are both signed, how confident are you that at some point in Yzerman's tenure, the Red Wings are going to make a conference final?
How long's the tenure?
Yeah, it's up to you.
50-50? Like, I know that's the most boring answer, but I don't think it's happening in the next 5 years. If they're not there in 5 years, though, is Yzerman still the GM? So I think they get there in the next 10 at some point. There's just too many prospects, and obviously between Seider, Raymond, and Larkin, for everything to not go right at least 1 year. But yeah, I don't think it's going to be quick.
I'm going to say yes here, because I think that if the Red Wings get into the playoffs 2-3 years from now, the style of players that they've drafted, as much as I know people have their qualms about, are they chasing enough upside? And I think Evan will be right with me on this. These are playoff guys, right? These are the kind of guys who win in the playoffs. Your Brandsegg-Nygards, your Kaspers. Like, this is what works in playoff hockey. And maybe it's not enough to get you past 4 different teams, but to get to a conference final, I think you have to think that they're going to have the right players to win a couple rounds of the playoffs. So I will say yes.
Yeah, we've talked about it a few times. Like, they're going to kind of have to, do the old out-depth thing of the top-heavy teams. And the Red Wings are kind of building that way. And, 5 years is a long way to project. The Red Wings could strike gold, and Emmett Finnie could become a superstar NHL player. Like, anything can happen. Free agents can become available almost at any time. You've got to think there is a likelihood that it could happen, right?
Like, I agree. I think in that 5 to 10 year window, the way the team's built, because I agree, when you have no superstars, you have to basically throw a bunch of assholes on the ice and just bully your way through a couple rounds. If Kosar Augustine turns out to be somebody, you can goalie your way through a round or two. The part of it that gives me pause is, are the Red Wings going to make the playoffs in 2 to 3 years? I like the 5 to 10 year window. I don't love the short term window, and that might hurt Yzerman's chances of being around for the 5 to 10 year window.
I think if you're with the question being like any timeline, I'm completely confident as well. Is that misguided? Sure, but I will take any ambiguity and the lack of ability to predict the NHL effectively, no matter who you are. I'm going to turn that into unbridled optimism just because. Now, the follow-up question we have here in this one from Evans RBF says, who makes the playoffs this year? Senators, Sabres, or Red Wings? And we'll save your Larkin question for the bonus overtime. But this year, Senators, Sabres, or Red Wings, who makes the playoffs, if any of them?
None.
You think none of the three will ascend?
I think it's going to be the same boring 4 running it back from the Atlantic. Off chance one of them sneaks into a wild card, but with the resurgence of New Jersey, the Metro's not too shallow either right now.
No, last season I didn't predict the Red Wings to make it, and I felt like they came within a, one puck bounce away of doing it. So I'm going to predict the same thing again this year in hopes that they'll make it. But in all honesty, I do think that the Red Wings I know the lineups are different and people have different opinions about what they did in the offseason versus what they didn't do. But until I see the Senators or the Sabres do anything like the Red Wings did last season, and that wasn't even achieving the playoffs, like I
do feel they need to point out that the year before last, Buffalo missed the playoffs by 1 point.
Well, Brad, that's inconvenient to my argument, so I'm going to throw that out the window. But in all honesty, great point. I think it's a coin flip for the Red Wings this year at best too, but that is much better in the past. So I'll say one of the three, and I'm going to continue my unbridled optimism, and I'm going to say the Red Wings are going to make it by a point. I don't care if that's logical or not. It's overtime.
Yeah, it's a tough call, right? Like, I kind of feel like any given year right now, either three of those teams could make it just based on some half decent form. You know, the Red Wings win a couple more games in December or March when they're sliding, you know, they make the playoffs. So it's so hard to predict. And like Brad said, New Jersey's coming off what I would say was a unpredictable season. They'll be right in the mix now. So, you know, until I see something that gives me confidence, I'm going with 0 as well.
I'll go with the Senators here, and it's the easy answer because of the goalie. But they're the one that went out and got a guy who can, you know, now the question is the durability with Ullmark. And I don't know that we've seen that he can be a 55 game guy at the level that he's been at the last couple of years while maintaining that. But I do think they have the best goalie of that quartet, or I guess trio. We didn't actually talk about Montreal, but I think they do belong pretty close to that conversation now, honestly. I'll go Ottawa.
Okay. Moving on here, Woodson2 says, what would need to happen to see Kosa play on the Wings this season, even if it's just one game? Thanks and love the pod. That's an easy answer. It's injuries. Or he pitches a ton of shutouts in the AHL, I guess.
I think the real way, because I think that's why they brought in Campbell, is for the extra insurance if there's injuries to come up and have that NHL vet. I think the real answer of how Kosa gets games isn't as fun. And if this season goes off the rails and they're playing for nothing in March and April, might as well give them a run.
Yeah, that's a great point. I still have airport travel day brain. Let's wrap up this episode of the Winged Wheel podcast. I'm going to edit and publish as soon as I can and then wait with bated breath for whenever the Seider news drops. But no matter what, exciting episode. This feels like the offseason is saying goodbye. Max, hell of an episode for you to join for your first ever Good in the Room segment, even though it wasn't at all about the main topic. But pleasure to have Max from the Athletic Detroit on the show for this first of his recurring segment as a Winged Wheel podcast contributor. We'd like to thank the sponsors of the Winged Wheel podcast for supporting the show. To all of our listeners, new and old, if you're a new listener, welcome. Exciting time to join. If you're a listener of old, hell of an episode, this one, compared to the rest of the offseason with the lack of news at points. If you want to support the Winged Wheel podcast, patreon.com/Winged Wheel podcast. It really does help us out. And if you want to support the show and Patreon's not for you, leave us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. It does make a difference. The thumbs up on YouTube, and subscribe wherever you get your show. Tell a friend. All of that is also a huge help to us. To all of our Patreon supporters, again, cannot thank you enough. And to our name level supporters on Patreon, thank you, thank you, thank you. Arjun Shankar, Eves Bartels on behalf of the Sarah Grand Foundation, Aikfer, Samuel Soderholm, Icon, Alexander Hansen, Victor Zetterberg, Ghost of OSBP, Glenn Brabham, Croner's Left Knee, Ashley Whitehead, Sea Lion, Matthew M. Rice, Admiral Matt S. at the Cheesebag Navy, Carl Brutinen Analuski, Carl Provy, Citizen High Five, Clip Clop Nene, Connor Scovey, Craig Kibble, Denny's Gamer Girl, Derek Enstam, Seider, Dickens, formerly Warren Winchester, DJ Denton, Elizabeth Rose Alvarez, Eric Hill, God Creatives, Give Blood Fight Probert, Goose Looney's Drinking Club, Hockeytown Love, Hockeytown Matt, Hassam Al-Qassem, Jay Gollum, Jacob Turner, Jeff Pridemore, Jonathan Miller, Kalen Wood, Marcus, Marty, Matt Keeler, Matt McKay, Michael Edlund, Missing a Tooth, R.A., Rawl, Pud, That's What I Appreciates About You, Riley Enright, Ryan Britt, Scott Martin, Skeletor, The New Jackson Five Holes, Timmy, Wallman's Elite Dancing D, Timmy, brand new name level supporter, welcome to the Dub Dub Club, and thank you for supporting the show. Eyes Are Playing Stan, General Andy Bohan of the Cheesebag Army, Sam Bankson, A.A. Ron, A.B., Adam Rose, All Motor No Hands, and Stanislavski, Axel Sandy Pelika, Bellingham Acid Balls, Chimkim Nuggets, Chuck Buff Chest, The Tarpless Goon, Commander Ben Barron of the Cheesebag Space Force, Connor Leighton, Corey Prida, Darren Fick, Datsukes Dangleberries, Eric Nance, Frank Stanley, Gene Sullivan, Goon in the Room, Griffey Boy, Ian, James Pridemore, Jeremiah Dobo, Jim, JM Rhapsody, Joey Jojo Shabadoo, John Evans Derogatory, John Ingalls, Josh Yelton, Keenan O'Donohue, Brad is Wrong and Plays Like Sprong, Kevin McCracken, Quaz, Les Grossman's Ungodly Firestorm, Linda Hull, Ophelia, Steven, The Hodag, The Hat 123, Trent Thorough, Wings fan in Chi-Town, Wings fan in St. Louis, Scott, and your second favorite patron. Thank you all so very much. We'll talk to you probably when Seider signs.
Thanks for tuning in to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Be sure to check out wingedwheelpodcast.com, where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll also find links to other ways to support the show, such as Patreon, official podcast apparel, and more. And don't forget to follow the show on Twitter at Winged Wheel Pod. And of course, the hosts at Brad Crisco, at Ryan Hanna WWP, and at Hockeytown Evan.